Story number 1. The Man Without a Past. In a world where corporate ambition fuels long hours and empty breakroom coffee pots, a perfect employee is more than rare, it's suspicious. I never considered that before. In fact, when Ethan Harper joined our team at Riventech, I was relieved. He was sharp, professional, and seemed immune to the petty drama that plagued the office. But perfection has a way of hiding its own darkness, a truth I learned far too late. It all began on an unremarkable Monday. Ethan walked into the conference room during our morning meeting, carrying a leather-bound notebook and wearing a suit so immaculate it put the rest of us to shame. He introduced himself with a disarming smile, his voice smooth and confident. "Pleasure to meet you all," he said, scanning the room with piercing blue eyes. "I'm looking forward to working with this team." By lunch, he'd memorized everyone's names and was chatting with the CEO like they were old friends. Within a week, he had single-handedly solved a logistics issue that had baffled our department for months. His charisma was magnetic, and his competence was undeniable. But there was something about him, something I couldn't put my finger on. At first, it was the little things. Ethan never joined us for after-work drinks or idle gossip by the coffee machine. He declined every invitation with a polite smile, always citing vague commitments. He never seemed to make mistakes, and when he wasn't at his desk, he was nowhere to be found. "He's like a ghost," Claire said one afternoon as we stood by the copier. She was the office's unofficial investigator, known for her ability to dig up dirt on anyone. "I mean, have you noticed how he always deflects questions about his personal life?" I had noticed, though I hadn't given it much thought. But Claire, ever curious, decided to dig deeper. She started by searching for him online, expecting to find LinkedIn profiles, old college photos, or even a poorly hidden Facebook page. She found nothing. No social media, no alumni records, no digital footprint whatsoever. "It's like he doesn't exist," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. From there, things took a darker turn. Claire confided in me that she'd emailed HR requesting Ethan's employment records. When she followed up a few days later, she was told the file was unavailable. That was odd, but not impossible. What unnerved her, and me, was the look in the HR manager's eyes when she mentioned Ethan's name. It was a flicker of fear, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. "Maybe he's just private," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Claire wasn't convinced. She started digging harder, asking questions and snooping where she shouldn't. I warned her to let it go, but she was relentless. And then, one day, she didn't show up for work. At first, we thought she was sick, but when she didn't answer her phone or respond to emails, people began to worry. A week passed, then another. The police visited the office, asking questions and taking statements. Her apartment was empty, her belongings untouched. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Ethan, of course, expressed his concern, though his words felt hollow. He continued his work with the same unflinching efficiency, his demeanor unchanged. It was as if Claire's disappearance had no effect on him. That's when I started paying attention. I noticed how people around him seemed to fade, their energy drained by his mere presence. The office grew quieter, the usual buzz of conversation replaced by a heavy silence. I began to feel it, too, an inexplicable exhaustion that made the days drag and the nights restless. One evening, after everyone had left, I stayed late to investigate. I logged into the company directory, searching for Ethan's file. Like Claire, I found nothing. No start date, no emergency contacts, not even a job title. It was as if he'd never been hired. That's when I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing in the empty office. My heart pounded as I turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Working late?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made my skin crawl. Yeah, I stammered, closing the browser. "Just trying to catch up." He nodded, his eyes lingering on me for a moment too long. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. But the unease stayed, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next day, I found an envelope on my desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words scrawled in red ink, "Stop digging." I wanted to believe it was a prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Ethan was watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more about me than I did about him. My dreams became nightmares, filled with shadowy figures and whispered warnings. Every time I saw Ethan, I felt a wave of nausea, as if my body were rejecting his very presence. I tried to quit, but my resignation email wouldn't send. My attempts to meet with HR were mysteriously rescheduled or canceled. It was as if the company itself was conspiring to keep me there. And through it all, Ethan remained a constant, his perfect facade unblemished. One night, I stayed late again, determined to confront him. I found him in the conference room, staring out the window at the city lights. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to know," he said simply. "I deserve to know," I shot back. "You're not normal. What are you hiding?" Ethan smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth or amusement. It was cold, predatory. "You're right," he said, stepping closer. "I'm not normal. And neither is this place. You think you're here by accident? That you can just leave?" The lights flickered, and for a moment, his face changed. His features blurred, his eyes blackened, and his skin took on an unnatural pallor. Then it was gone, leaving me questioning my sanity. "You should have listened to Claire," he said. "She tried to warn you." I ran. I don't remember how I got home, but when I did, my apartment was dark, my belongings scattered as if someone had searched through them. My laptop and phone were gone, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. The next morning, my desk was empty. Ethan greeted me with his usual smile, but I couldn't meet his gaze. I knew better now. He wasn't human, or if he was, he wasn't anymore. He was something else, something ancient and malevolent, hiding behind a perfect mask. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. My emails bounce, my phone doesn't work, and every time I try to leave the building, I find myself back at my desk. The office is quieter now, the empty desks multiplying. And Ethan? He's always there, watching, waiting. If you're reading this, heed my warning, don't trust perfection. And if you ever meet someone like Ethan Harper, run. Don't look back. Story number 2. The office after hours. The glow of the city faded into darkness as the clock on my desk read 11:47 p.m. Most of my colleagues had gone hours ago, their computers humming into sleep mode, their chairs tucked neatly under desks. But across the room, in the corner by the window, Greg's desk was still lit up. His silhouette hunched over his keyboard, unmoving. Greg. The perfect employee. Always the first to arrive and the last to leave. It was a running joke in the office, a source of mild amusement during coffee breaks. "Greg's married to his work," they'd say with a chuckle. But for me, it had become something more, an itch I couldn't scratch, a question I couldn't shake. Why was Greg always here? And why did no one else seem to care? It started innocently enough. I'd stay late to finish reports or clean up my inbox, and there he'd be, typing away, his face illuminated by the pale light of his monitor. At first, I thought he was just dedicated, maybe even lonely. But then I noticed the patterns, the way he never seemed to take breaks, the way his lunch sat untouched on his desk, the way his clothes never wrinkled or stained. The breaking point came on a Friday night. I had stayed behind to prep for a Monday presentation, the office eerily silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. I'd been working for hours when I looked up and saw Greg sitting there, his posture rigid, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. It was nearly midnight. "Hey, Greg," I called out, forcing a casual tone. "You ever go home?" He didn't respond. His fingers kept tapping at the keys, though the screen in front of him showed nothing but a blank document. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I grabbed my bag and left without another word, the sound of his typing following me into the elevator. That weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was Greg, really? I searched online for anything that might explain him, social media, LinkedIn, even an old company directory. There was nothing. No photos, no records, no evidence that Greg existed outside of the office. It was as if he only lived from 9 to 5, or, in his case, 24/7. On Monday, I decided to stay late again, determined to get answers. I packed a thermos of coffee and told myself I'd confront him if it came to that. By 9 p.m., the office was empty except for the two of us. By 10 p.m., I was pretending to work, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. By 11 p.m., I'd had enough. I stood and walked over to his desk, the sound of my footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness. He didn't acknowledge me as I approached, his fingers dancing over the keyboard in a rhythm that seemed mechanical. His screen was blank. "Greg," I said, my voice firmer this time. "What are you doing?" He stopped typing. Slowly, he turned to face me, his movements unnaturally smooth. For the first time, I noticed how pale he was, his skin almost translucent under the harsh office lights. His eyes met mine, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. They were empty, like windows looking into a void. "I have work to do," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You should leave." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I backed away, returning to my desk under the pretense of gathering my things. But I didn't leave. I waited, watching him from the shadows, the hum of the office growing louder in my ears. At midnight, something changed. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. Greg stood, his movements stiff, almost jerky, and began walking toward the conference room. Curious and terrified, I followed, keeping to the shadows. He didn't turn on the lights as he entered, but the room was dimly illuminated by the city lights outside. He wasn't alone. Figures stood in the corners of the room, their forms barely visible but undeniably human. Their faces were obscured, their features blurred as if they were out of focus. Greg stood in the center of the room, his head bowed, his lips moving in a silent chant. The figures began to move, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they surrounded him. The air grew colder still, my breath fogging in front of me. I couldn't move, my feet rooted to the spot as the figures closed in around Greg. They seemed to merge with him, their forms dissolving into his body like smoke. His head snapped up, his eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural light. Then he turned and looked directly at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I ran for the exit. The office felt like a maze, the corridors stretching endlessly, the walls closing in. I could hear Greg's voice behind me, calm and steady, growing louder with each step. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said. "This isn't your place." I burst into the stairwell, tripping and falling down the steps in my haste. When I finally reached the lobby, the security guard was gone, and the front doors were locked. I pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but the city outside was silent. And then I saw him. Standing at the top of the stairs, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the office. He didn't move, but I could feel his presence, oppressive and suffocating. Somehow, I escaped. I don't remember how, but I found myself outside, gasping for air as the cold night wind hit my face. The office tower loomed behind me, its windows dark except for one, a single light in the corner, where Greg's desk was. I quit the next day. No one questioned my sudden departure, and I didn't offer any explanations. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the office, of the figures in the conference room, and of Greg's glowing eyes. I don't know what he is, or what he wants. But I do know one thing, Greg never leaves the office. And if you ever find yourself working late, alone in an empty building, be careful. Because he might be there, waiting for you to stay just a little too long. Story number 3. The Cursed Desk. When I first started at Corman and Finch, I didn't think much of the desk they assigned me. It was a plain, unassuming cubicle tucked into the corner of the sprawling open office. The walls were beige, the desk itself scuffed and worn, and the swivel chair squeaked with every movement. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, or so I thought. "Guess you're at Erica's old desk," said Michelle, the HR rep who gave me the tour. She said it lightly, almost absent-mindedly, but the way her eyes darted away afterward struck me as odd. "Erica?" I asked. "She worked here before, well, before you," Michelle replied quickly, her voice tight. "Anyway, let me know if you need anything." That was the last time anyone mentioned Erica directly, though her presence lingered like a shadow over my first week. There were whispers around the coffee machine, quiet glances from my coworkers, and an awkward pause whenever her name accidentally slipped into conversation. It wasn't until I overheard someone mutter the accident that I decided to dig deeper. Erica was in an accident? I asked Dan, the IT guy, as he fixed a printer near my desk. His hands froze mid-motion, and he glanced at me like I'd just said something forbidden. Yeah, he said finally. She died here. Late one night. But you don't want to know about that. Of course, I did. I spent the next hour scouring the internet, but there was barely anything about her death. A single article mentioned a workplace accident at Corman and Finch, with no details. It wasn't much, but it set my imagination racing. How could someone die at a desk job? The strange occurrences started a week later. At first, it was small things, a pen rolling off the desk, a faint tapping noise that seemed to come from nowhere. I chalked it up to the air conditioning or my own clumsiness. But then the files started to move. One morning, I arrived to find a stack of papers on my desk neatly arranged into two piles. I hadn't touched them the night before, and no one else should have either. Another time, I left my cup of coffee half full on the desk, only to find it empty when I returned. It was as if someone had been there, sitting in my chair, touching my things. Maybe Erica doesn't like someone else using her desk, Michelle joked when I mentioned it, but her laugh was hollow, and her eyes didn't meet mine. The real horror began one Thursday evening, when I stayed late to finish a report. The office was eerily quiet, the usual hum of voices replaced by the distant whir of air vents. As I typed, I became aware of a noise, soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard, and listened. It was coming from my desk. Slowly, I looked down. Nothing. The sound stopped the moment my eyes moved, leaving me questioning whether I'd imagined it. But as soon as I returned to my screen, it started again, louder this time. Tap. 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 I pushed back my chair and stood, my heart pounding. Hello? I called out, my voice echoing in the empty office. No response. Suddenly, my monitor flickered. The screen went black, then white, then black again, before displaying something that wasn't my report. It was a single line of text, typed in a shaky, uneven font. Why are you here? I stumbled back, nearly knocking over my chair. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stared at the screen, which now showed nothing but my desktop. Had I imagined it? A glitch, maybe? I grabbed my things and left, refusing to look back. The next day, I found a photo on my desk. It wasn't there when I left, and no one else should have had access to my space. It showed a group of people at an office party, all smiling and laughing. I recognized some of my coworkers, Michelle, Dan, and a few others, but at the center of the photo was a woman I'd never seen before. She was young, with dark hair and a warm smile, and she was sitting at my desk. Written on the back of the photo, in faded ink, was a single word, Erica. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of the office, but it was twisted, wrong. The walls bled shadows, the lights buzzed and flickered, and the air was heavy with a metallic tang. I saw Erica sitting at the desk, her back to me. When she turned around, her face was pale, her eyes sunken and hollow, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. I woke up drenched in sweat, her image burned into my mind. I tried to avoid the office after that, taking sick days and working remotely whenever possible. But the desk wouldn't let me go. I started seeing Erica's face everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, even in the corner of my vision when I blinked. The tapping followed me home, faint but persistent, like a reminder that I couldn't escape. Desperate for answers, I confronted Michelle. She looked panicked when I brought up Erica, her face pale as she led me into a conference room and shut the door. Erica didn't just die, she whispered, her voice trembling. She fell. From the balcony near the break room. It was late, and no one else was here. The cameras didn't catch what happened, but people said they heard her scream. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because no one knows why it happened, Michelle said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And we're all terrified it wasn't an accident. I didn't go back to the office after that. I emailed my resignation the next morning and packed up my things after hours, refusing to spend another night alone at that desk. But even now, as I write this, I can feel her presence. The tapping hasn't stopped, and sometimes, in the reflection of my monitor, I see a shadow that doesn't belong. The desk is still there, waiting for its next occupant. If you're ever assigned to it, take my advice: don't stay late, don't ask questions, and whatever you do, don't look into the screen too long. Because Erica is still there, and she doesn't like to be ignored. Story number 4. The Midnight Shadow. In every office, there's always that one person everyone loves, charming, funny, and endlessly dependable. For us, that person was Nathan. He had a smile that could brighten the dreariest Monday, a knack for solving problems no one else could, and an uncanny ability to make everyone feel like his best friend. He was, by all accounts, perfect. But perfection is a mask. And masks always hide something. It became a tradition to hit the pub after work, decompressing with beers and swapping stories about our day. Nathan always came along, laughing at jokes, sharing just enough about himself to keep the conversation flowing. Yet there were cracks in his facade, small at first but impossible to ignore once you noticed them. For one, Nathan never drank. At first, he'd wave it off with a friendly "not tonight," but eventually, someone called him out on it. "Come on, Nathan," Jeff said one evening, nudging him with an elbow. "You've got to have one drink with us. It's practically a law." Nathan's smile didn't falter, but his response was measured. "I've just never been much of a drinker," he said, shrugging. "But don't let me stop you guys." There was also the matter of his schedule. No matter how late the rest of us stayed, Nathan always left before midnight. Early riser, he'd say with a grin, tossing a few bills on the table before disappearing into the night. We teased him for it, of course, calling him Cinderella and joking about his mysterious curfew. He'd laugh along, but there was something guarded in his expression, a flicker of tension that made the jokes feel like stepping too close to a cliff's edge. One night, curiosity got the better of us. It was a Friday, and the group was in high spirits after a big client win. As usual, Nathan excused himself around 11:30, waving goodbye as he headed out the door. But this time, instead of letting him go, Jeff leaned across the table and whispered, "Let's see where he goes." We hesitated, half laughing, half nervous, but the beer had loosened our inhibitions. So we paid our tab, grabbed our jackets, and followed Nathan into the cool night air. At first, it felt like a game. We stayed far enough behind to avoid being noticed, giggling like kids playing a prank. But as we trailed him through the quiet streets, the atmosphere shifted. Nathan's pace was steady, almost mechanical, his movements too precise. The further he walked, the more deserted the streets became, until we found ourselves in an unfamiliar part of town, where the streetlights buzzed weakly, and shadows stretched long and deep. "Where the hell is he going?" Sarah whispered, clutching her coat tighter around her. We didn't have an answer. Nathan finally stopped in front of an old, decrepit warehouse, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. He glanced around, his movements sharp and deliberate, before slipping inside through a side door. "This is insane," Jeff muttered, though his eyes were wide with excitement. "We've got to see what he's up to." Reluctantly, we followed, easing the door open and stepping into the darkness. The air inside was heavy and stale, the faint smell of mildew mingling with something metallic. We crept forward, our footsteps muffled by the grime-coated floor, until we saw him. Nathan stood in the center of the room, his back to us. A dim, flickering light illuminated the space, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He was holding something, a small, black object that seemed to shimmer, even in the dimness. He whispered to it, his voice low and guttural, a language none of us recognized. Then he changed. It wasn't immediate, but gradual, like a ripple spreading across water. His body seemed to elongate, his limbs stretching unnaturally. His skin darkened, taking on a slick, almost oily sheen. When he turned, his face was no longer Nathan's. His eyes were black voids, his mouth a twisted mauve that didn't belong on a human face. Sarah stifled a scream, and Nathan, or whatever he had become, snapped his head in our direction. The air grew colder as he stepped toward us, his movements fluid and predatory. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice layered with something inhuman. "I was content to live among you, to play your games. But you've broken the rules." We stumbled backward, terror overtaking us as he advanced. The flickering light revealed more details, claw-like hands, sharp teeth glinting as he grinned. Jeff, always the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it at Nathan. It never connected. Nathan moved too quickly, grabbing Jeff's wrist and twisting it with a sickening crack. He flung him aside like a rag doll, and Jeff's body hit the wall with a thud before crumpling to the floor. "Run!" Sarah screamed, pulling me toward the door. We bolted, our breath ragged as we sprinted into the night. Behind us, Nathan's voice echoed, mocking and inhuman. "You can't run forever." We didn't stop until we were back in familiar territory, collapsing onto a park bench as adrenaline coursed through our veins. Jeff was gone. Nathan was gone. And we were left with the horrifying realization that the friendly coworker we thought we knew had never been human. The next day, Nathan was back at work, sitting at his desk as if nothing had happened. He greeted us with his usual smile, but there was something in his eyes, a knowing glint that sent chills down my spine. I quit a week later. Sarah left not long after. Jeff's disappearance was never investigated, and Nathan remained the perfect employee, charming and efficient. But I know the truth. He's still out there, hiding in plain sight, playing at being one of us. If you ever meet someone like Nathan, someone too perfect, too good to be true, listen to your instincts. And whatever you do, don't follow them into the dark. Because there are some things in this world better left unknown. Story number 5. The Endless Meeting. Monday mornings are bad enough without a 7:30 a.m. meeting on the agenda. The email arrived late Sunday night, marked urgent and requiring attendance from our department. Conference Room C, it said, with a vague subject line, Strategic Reorganization Initiative. My manager, Ed, was infamous for these last-minute powwows, and none of us dared to skip. I arrived early, as usual, the coffee in my travel mug still too hot to drink. The building was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow on the empty corridors. Most of the office didn't start until 9, but Conference Room C's door was ajar, and faint voices drifted out. Inside, a group of 8 people sat around the long mahogany table, including Ed, who stood at the head of the room. Everyone else seemed vaguely familiar, faces I recognized from other departments, though I couldn't put names to most of them. They all looked tired, their eyes slightly glazed. "Glad you could make it," Ed said when he saw me. "Take a seat. We're just getting started." I slipped into an empty chair near the back, my usual spot for these meetings. The air in the room felt heavy, stifling in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I sipped my coffee, trying to shake the strange sense of unease creeping over me. Ed began his presentation, flipping through slides that were as generic as they were endless, stock photos, meaningless graphs, and buzzwords strung together into a corporate word salad. I tried to focus, but the words seemed to blur, slipping through my mind like sand through a sieve. I glanced at my watch. It was 7:45. Then it was 7:45 again. I blinked, frowning as I checked my phone. The screen confirmed it, 7:45. I could have sworn at least 15 minutes had passed. I looked around the room, but no one else seemed to notice. They sat motionless, their faces blank, staring at Ed as he droned on about streamlining operational paradigms. The unease grew stronger. By the time my watch hit 7:45 for the 4th time, I knew something was wrong. The air was thicker now, almost oppressive, and the fluorescent lights above seemed dimmer than before. My colleagues' faces looked off. Their skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and their movements were slow, mechanical, as if they were marionettes on invisible strings. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "How long is this meeting supposed to last?" Ed paused mid-sentence, his head snapping toward me like a bird of prey. For a moment, his face seemed to glitch, his features flickering like static on a broken screen. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't reach his eyes. "As long as it needs to," he said, his voice layered with something cold and hollow. I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need to step out, I muttered, heading for the door. But the door wasn't there. The wall where the door should have been was smooth and unbroken, as if the room had sealed itself shut. My heart pounded as I turned back to the table. No one moved. No one even blinked. They all stared at me now, their blank faces eerily synchronized. "You can't leave," Ed said, his grin widening. "We're not finished." Panic set in as I backed away, my hands fumbling for the wall behind me. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air suffocating. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the faces around the table weren't human. Their features twisted, their eyes black pits, their mouths gaping voids. And then, just as quickly, they were normal again, or close enough to pass for it. "Sit down," Ed said, his voice sharp and commanding. Against my will, I did. My body moved on its own, my legs folding under me as I sank back into the chair. The table felt colder now, almost freezing, and when I touched it, my fingertips came away damp. The surface seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. Ed resumed his presentation, but his words were no longer in English or any language I recognized. They were guttural, alien sounds that made my head ache and my vision blur. The others nodded along as if they understood, their faces blank and serene. I looked at my watch. 7:45. Again and again, 7:45. Time had lost all meaning. The meeting stretched on endlessly, each second a weight pressing down on my chest. The air grew colder, and the lights dimmed further until the room was bathed in a sickly, grayish glow. My colleagues' faces continued to shift, their features melting and reforming like wax figures under a flame. I don't know how long I sat there, trapped in that nightmare. Hours? Days? Weeks? My stomach growled, my throat dry and raw, but I couldn't leave, couldn't move, couldn't escape the endless loop. I tried to speak, to scream, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive silence. And then, suddenly, I was alone. The chairs were empty, the table bare. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. My watch read 7:46, and for the first time, the time changed. Relief flooded through me, and I stumbled to my feet, the door now back where it should have been. I didn't look back as I fled the building, the early morning sun blinding me as I burst into the parking lot. My car was still there, my phone still in my pocket. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I quit that day, refusing to return to the office. When I tried to explain what had happened, no one believed me. They said there was no meeting scheduled for that morning, that no one named Ed had ever worked at the company. My emails were gone, my calendar wiped clean. It was as if the entire experience had been erased. But I remember. I remember the flickering faces, the endless loop, the oppressive weight of the air in that room. And I know this, somewhere, in some twisted corner of reality, that meeting is still happening, still pulling people into its endless spiral. If you ever find yourself invited to an early morning meeting, think twice before you go. Because once you step into that room, you might never step out again. Story number 6. The Stranger in Sam's Skin. Sam was the kind of coworker everyone liked. He was the first to bring donuts on Fridays, the first to laugh at a bad joke, and the one who always stayed late to help clean up after office parties. For 3 years, he'd been the heart of our team, the glue that held us together. So when he came back from a week-long vacation acting different, we all noticed. It started small. Sam forgot names he'd used effortlessly before, paused too long before answering simple questions, and smiled in a way that felt rehearsed. At first, we chalked it up to stress. Everyone's been there, right? A bad week or two, and you're not quite yourself. But this wasn't that. Did Sam seem off to you this morning? Claire whispered during our coffee break. I nodded, unsure how to articulate what I'd been feeling since his return. Like he's trying too hard, I said. Like he's pretending to be Sam. Claire frowned. Exactly. We started paying closer attention after that, watching him out of the corners of our eyes. The way he moved was just a little too precise, too deliberate. He never fidgeted or stumbled over his words like before. And his eyes, there was something cold about them, like he was looking at us without really seeing us. Maybe it's stress, Jeff suggested one day, though his voice lacked conviction. Or some kind of therapy thing? People change after stuff like that. But Sam's change wasn't for the better. He stopped bringing donuts. He didn't laugh at jokes anymore, not even the good ones. And when I stayed late one evening to finish a report, I caught him sitting at his desk, staring at his monitor. Not typing, not clicking, just staring. The screen was black. "Sam?" I called, my voice shaky. He turned his head slowly, too slowly, and smiled. It wasn't the warm, familiar grin I knew. It was something else entirely, something hollow. "Working late?" he asked, his voice flat. I muttered some excuse and left, but the encounter haunted me. That wasn't Sam. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't him. The turning point came during the next team meeting. Sam used to be the guy who kept things light, cracking jokes to ease the tension. But now, he sat silently at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly, his gaze fixed on each of us in turn. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and unsettlingly detached. "We're restructuring the team," he announced. "What?" Claire blurted, her face pale. "Why?" "We're performing better than ever." Sam's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in his expression, something predatory. "Change is necessary," he said. "Adaptation is survival." No one dared to argue. The meeting ended in uncomfortable silence, and as we filed out of the room, Claire whispered to me, "That's not him." I don't know what's wrong, but that's not Sam. The next day, Claire didn't come to work. Her absence sent a ripple of unease through the office. She hadn't called in sick, and no one could reach her. When I asked Sam if he'd heard from her, he just shrugged. "People move on," he said, his tone dismissive. By the end of the week, 2 more coworkers had vanished. Their desks were cleared out overnight, and no one seemed to question it except me. I tried calling, emailing, even stopping by their apartments, but they were gone, no forwarding addresses, no explanations. And Sam? He was still there, sitting at his desk with that eerie, calculated stillness. He no longer tried to act like the old Sam. He didn't need to. The rest of the office fell into line, their fear keeping them silent. I couldn't take it anymore. One night, I stayed late, determined to find answers. I logged into Sam's computer, using a password I'd seen him type 100 times. What I found chilled me to the bone. His emails were empty, no messages sent or received. His calendar was blank. His browser history was wiped clean, except for one bookmarked page, a grainy video file titled Integration. I clicked it. The video was shaky, clearly filmed on a phone. It showed a dark room filled with faintly glowing pods, their surfaces slick and pulsating. Inside each pod was a human shape, their features indistinct. A low, rhythmic hum filled the audio, almost like chanting. Then the camera panned, and I saw Sam, or someone who looked like him, standing in the center of the room, staring at the camera with a cold, unblinking gaze. "You've been chosen," the Sam in the video said. "It's your turn to adapt." I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, and I turned to see Sam standing in the doorway, his face expressionless. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the building, but when I reached the safety of my car, I looked back to see Sam standing at the window, his figure backlit by the office lights. He didn't move, didn't follow. He just watched. The next day, I quit. I didn't go back for my things, didn't tell anyone why. I just left. But Sam, or whatever he is, still haunts me. Sometimes, I see him in the reflections of shop windows or sitting on park benches, always watching. I don't know what he is or what he wants. But I know this, he's not alone. If someone you know suddenly changes, if they seem too perfect, too controlled, trust your instincts. Some masks hide more than a smile. Some masks hide something not human at all. Story number 7. The Cabinet of Shadows. I always hated the office at night. The endless hum of fluorescent lights, the cavernous silence broken only by the occasional groan of the air conditioning, it all felt wrong. But after a week of covering extra shifts for a sick coworker, I'd grown accustomed to the unease. Or so I thought. The tedium was broken one evening when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just the building settling. The sound echoed in the quiet space, soft but persistent, coming from somewhere near the corner of the room. Specifically, from the old filing cabinet in the corner. It had belonged to Brian, the guy who used to sit across from me. Brian had been a quiet, unassuming sort, kept to himself, did his work, and avoided office gossip. One day, about a month ago, he simply didn't show up. No notice, no goodbye email, no explanation. Management said he'd quit, but something about it didn't sit right. Brian didn't seem like the type to just disappear. The cabinet had remained untouched since. HR had planned to clean it out, but like most things in the office, it had been forgotten. Until tonight. The tapping grew louder as I approached, like tiny fingernails drumming against metal. I told myself it was probably a loose file rattling inside, but that didn't explain how the noise started on its own. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment before I took a deep breath and pulled it open. The top drawer slid out with a groan, revealing a meticulously organized array of manila folders. Each one was labeled with a name, our names. My name was there too, scrawled in Brian's neat handwriting. I stared at it, the hairs on my neck prickling. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the folder with my name and flipped it open. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some were recent, taken in the office, while others were older, from office parties and team outings. But it wasn't just the photos that unnerved me, it was the notes scribbled in red ink along the edges. Arrives at 8:15 every day. Always orders black coffee. Spends lunch alone. Stares out the window when stressed. I flipped through the pages, my pulse quickening. These weren't just observations, they were intimate details, things no one should know about me. There were even entries about my private life, what I ate for dinner, the books I borrowed from the library. My stomach churned as I realized someone had been watching me. I shoved the folder back into the drawer and grabbed another, this one labeled Claire. The same pattern repeated, photos, notes, detailed accounts of her daily routine. Claire had left the company 6 months ago, supposedly for a better job, but I couldn't help but wonder if she'd known about this. Drawer after drawer revealed the same disturbing contents. Every employee, past and present, had a folder, each filled with the same obsessive level of detail. Some files even included personal items, scraps of paper with handwriting samples, ticket stubs, pieces of hair taped to the inside covers. It was a shrine to paranoia. The final drawer was locked. Unlike the others, which had slid open with ease, this one resisted my attempts to pry it loose. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. My reflection in the cabinet's polished surface looked pale and distorted, like someone else entirely. I grabbed a paperclip from my desk, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the lock. The drawer finally gave way, and the metallic screech echoed through the empty office. Inside was a single folder, thicker than the rest, labeled in bold, red letters, Brian. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The contents were different this time, no photos, no notes. Instead, there were pages and pages of rambling text, written in frantic, messy handwriting. Words overlapped, sentences trailed off mid-thought, and the tone shifted between anger, fear, and despair. They're watching me. They know what I've done. The shadows are everywhere, creeping closer. I can't stop them. One phrase was repeated over and over, scratched into the paper with such force that it tore the pages, the cabinet knows. My breath caught as I reached the last page, where a single Polaroid was taped. It showed Brian sitting at his desk, staring directly into the camera with hollow, empty eyes. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, a silhouette with impossibly long arms and no discernible features. The edges of the photo were burned, the corners curling inward like they'd been scorched. The room felt colder, the air heavy with an unspoken threat. The lights above flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty office, stretching into the dark. I stuffed the folder back into the drawer and slammed it shut, my heart pounding. The tapping started again, louder this time, as if the cabinet was alive, its metallic shell vibrating with each hollow knock. I backed away, grabbing my coat and bag, and bolted for the exit. I didn't come in the next day, or the day after that. I called in sick, though I knew I wouldn't be returning. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabinet was still there, still watching, its drawers filled with secrets it had no right to hold. 2 weeks later, I heard that another employee had been assigned to Brian's old desk. I wanted to warn them, to tell them what I'd seen, but what could I say? That the filing cabinet was cursed? That it was keeping tabs on all of us, recording our lives in eerie, obsessive detail? I've moved on to a new job, but the unease hasn't left me. Some nights, I still hear the tapping in my dreams, soft and persistent, like a reminder that the cabinet hasn't forgotten me. And sometimes, when I look over my shoulder, I swear I see a shadow that doesn't belong. If you ever find yourself in an office late at night, and you hear tapping from a filing cabinet, do yourself a favor, leave. Don't open it. Don't let it see you. Because once it does, it might never let you go. Story number 8. The Ghost in the Inbox. When I first got the email, I thought it was a prank. It was late, the kind of hour when the office was silent except for the hum of computers and the occasional creak of the old HVAC system. I was alone, finishing a quarterly report that should have been done hours earlier, when my inbox chimed with a new message. The sender's name froze me mid-click, Michael Reynolds. Michael had been my colleague, my friend even, before he died 3 years ago. A car accident, they said. Sudden, tragic, and wholly unfair. His desk had been cleared within a week, his files reassigned, and his name gradually became just a memory we shared over drinks after work. But here it was, staring at me from the sender line, like a ghost whispering my name. I hesitated before clicking. The subject line read, "It's not over." My heart raced as the email opened, revealing a short, cryptic message. "You're not safe there. Leave before they find you. Check the files in storage. You'll understand." It felt like a sick joke. Michael's email had been deactivated after his death, and yet, here it was. The timestamp showed it had been sent mere minutes ago. I leaned back in my chair, glancing around the empty office. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the hum of the fluorescent lights above felt deafening. Trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine, I forwarded the email to IT, attaching a quick note asking if they could trace it. It had to be a glitch, some weird leftover artifact from the server, or maybe someone's twisted idea of a joke. But curiosity gnawed at me. Michael had been working on something before he died, a project he'd mentioned in passing but never elaborated on. Sensitive stuff, he'd said with a smirk, his usual air of mystery clouding the details. After his accident, his files had been locked away in the basement storage room, filed under inactive and forgotten. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. The basement storage room was as unsettling as I remembered, dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of dust and mildew. The rows of metal shelves stretched endlessly, crammed with aging folders, unmarked boxes, and outdated office supplies. I found Michael's section near the back, marked with a faded label bearing his name. The box was heavier than I expected, its contents spilling over with binders, notebooks, and USB drives. As I rummaged through the materials, one file caught my eye, a thick manila folder with Project Pandora scrawled across the front in Michael's handwriting. Inside were pages upon pages of notes, diagrams, and printed emails. My stomach churned as I read the contents. Michael had been investigating something, anomalies within the company, suspicious contracts, strange disappearances. Employees who had quit without notice, projects that had been quietly shut down, entire departments erased from records. His notes suggested something far darker, that the company was involved in experiments, using employees as unwitting test subjects. The deeper I read, the colder the room seemed to grow. One note in particular made my blood run cold. "They know I'm onto them. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident." The lights flickered, snapping me out of my trance. I gathered the files and bolted upstairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. Back at my desk, I locked the door and spread the documents across my workspace, snapping photos on my phone for safekeeping. I didn't know what I'd stumbled onto, but I knew it wasn't safe. My computer chimed with another email. This time, the subject line read, "Stop digging." There was no sender, just a blank line where the name should have been. The message was short and chilling. "You're making a mistake. Forget what you found." I froze, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. Before I could dial IT, the screen went black. The power in the office surged, the lights dimming and the computers shutting down. A mechanical whirring filled the room, like the building itself was alive, breathing. The temperature dropped sharply, and I swore I heard footsteps in the hallway. I grabbed my bag, stuffing the files inside, and headed for the exit. The elevator was out, so I took the stairs, my heart pounding with each step. As I reached the lobby, I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Don't trust them." It was Michael's voice. I spun around, but the lobby was empty, the shadows still and silent. My instinct screamed at me to run, so I did, bursting out into the night and gasping for air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. The next morning, I emailed my resignation. I didn't bother explaining why. I knew no one would believe me. I left the files with a journalist friend, someone I trusted to uncover the truth without implicating me. A week later, he stopped returning my calls. I don't know what happened to him, and I don't want to know. I've moved to a new city, taken a new job, and cut ties with anyone from the company. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the chime of an email notification, and my stomach knots with dread. I've stopped checking my inbox. I don't want to know what's waiting for me there. Story number 9. The call from the break room. Working the night shift in an office tower is lonely, but it's a quiet kind of loneliness that you can learn to live with. The stillness grows on you, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the software of the HVAC system, and the occasional clatter of an old vending machine releasing its prize. But the quiet is also where your mind wanders, where shadows take on shapes they shouldn't, and where sounds carry weight they shouldn't have. It was nearing 2 a.m., and I was halfway through my shift, buried in spreadsheets that needed attention before the day crew arrived. My phone buzzed on the desk, startling me from my work. The caller ID displayed break room. My stomach twisted. The break room didn't have a phone. Curious but cautious, I picked up. "Hello?" A faint voice, barely more than a whisper, came through. "Help, please." The line clicked dead before I could respond. I stared at the receiver, my pulse quickening. The rational part of me wanted to chalk it up to a prank or a misrouted call, but there was something in that voice, something desperate. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the break room. The office was a maze at night, the hallways dimly lit and the usual buzz of daytime activity replaced with an oppressive silence. The break room sat at the far end of the floor, its frosted glass door faintly illuminated by the glow of the vending machines inside. I pushed the door open. Empty. The chairs were neatly tucked under the table, the sink spotless, and the microwave's digital clock blinked its steady 2:05 a.m. But the air felt wrong, heavy. And then I noticed the coffee machine. It was on, the glass carafe half full with steaming black liquid. That was strange. I hadn't made coffee all night, and no one else was supposed to be here. I turned off the machine and left, brushing off the oddness as sleep deprivation playing tricks on me. But as I returned to my desk, my phone buzzed again. Break room, the display read. I froze. My hand hovered over the receiver, but this time I didn't answer. Instead, I let it ring out, each chime digging into my nerves. When it finally stopped, I exhaled, only for the office phone to ring immediately after. The number? Break room. Gripping the receiver, I answered, my voice sharper than I intended. Who is this? The same faint voice, but now clearer, closer. Help me, he's here. Who's there? Where are you? I demanded. The line crackled, and the voice returned, trembling. Basement. Before I could respond, the call disconnected. I sat frozen for a moment, the air around me thick with unease. The basement hadn't been used in years, ever since the company expanded to the upper floors. It was essentially a graveyard for old furniture and forgotten files, a place no one willingly ventured into. But something compelled me to go. Maybe it was the desperation in the voice, or maybe it was sheer curiosity. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way to the elevator and hit the button for the lowest floor. The doors opened to reveal a corridor bathed in shadow, the faint hum of the overhead lights barely penetrating the darkness. The air was colder here, tinged with the scent of mildew and metal. I stepped out, the sound of my own footsteps amplified in the stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. "Is anyone here?" The only response was the distant drip of water. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the space, revealing rows of abandoned desks, filing cabinets, and discarded office supplies. And then I saw it, a phone sitting on one of the desks, its receiver off the hook. My breath caught in my throat as I approached. The phone began to ring. I nearly dropped the flashlight. The sound was deafening in the silence, unnatural in its clarity. With trembling hands, I picked up the receiver. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered, now guttural, almost inhuman. I dropped the phone and spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Movement. A shadow darted across the far wall, too fast to be human. My heart pounded as I backed away, my flashlight flickering. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for me. I turned and ran, my breath ragged as I navigated the maze of desks and filing cabinets. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, heavy and deliberate, matching my pace. I didn't dare look back. Reaching the elevator, I slammed the button repeatedly, praying for the doors to open. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right behind me. Just as I felt the cold breath of something unnatural on the back of my neck, the doors slid open, and I threw myself inside, punching the button for my floor. The doors closed, and the elevator began its ascent, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade. I looked up, and my reflection in the polished metal walls stared back at me. But it wasn't my reflection. The face was distorted, twisted into a mocking grin that wasn't mine. The elevator jerked to a stop, the lights flickering as the doors slid open to reveal the break room. My break room. The coffee machine was running again, its steady drip echoing like a ticking clock. And sitting at the table was a figure, its face obscured, its presence radiating malice. The phone in the corner rang once more. I never answered it. I ran, abandoning the office, my belongings, and my job. The next morning, I called in sick, but no one answered. When I returned to the building later that week to collect my things, I was met with an empty lot. The office tower was gone, replaced by an expanse of barren land, as if it had never been there at all. But sometimes, late at night, my phone buzzes. The caller ID reads break room. And no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to block the number.